Really, I think the gift is the way Krakauer wrote it. So
Yeah.
the way Krakauer presented that information to them,
Right.
I think that's what made it compelling.
Uh-huh.
So he was able to tie in those other stories of adventurers, also how the angst, right, that teenagers have.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they could relate to that part of it. The reckless behavior, we talked about that and we kind of examined it to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think my students consider themselves teens who act recklessly. So while they could push that on somebody else as, oh yeah, I do know people that act recklessly, but so I can appreciate and empathize and maybe sympathize with people that end up doing things that they're not supposed to, but none of them admitted that they were teens that did that.
Right,
So
right. Well, it might
that was kind of interesting, but
might
I
take
think
4 years of the college experience
Yeah,
might convince them
Yeah.
that a heavy percentage actually do engage in reckless behavior.
Yeah, and like, as a matter of fact, we talked about post high school and what they should and should not be doing, but that's another story. But I think they were compelled by the way Krakauer put this together, and I think they enjoyed that. When it starts with Chris is dead, just about. So
Yeah.
some
Yes,
of the students
yeah.
immediately thought, this is kind of anticlimactic. Why are we learning about somebody's fate so early? Where's the
Right.
buildup? So I thought, those that were already dismissing this, the way Krakauer produced the information and how he kind of jumped back and forth, I made an analogy with film, how some films will do that, take you into the future and then bring you back to
Right. Yeah, it's quite a few now, actually.
Right, it's quite a few.
Follow
So we
that structure, yeah.
referenced some that students probably shouldn't watch at this age because they're rated R, but they were familiar with them. So I think they like that. And then that's when it started to build some momentum for them in their own minds. And then it became more compelling. And by the time we got to the end, they knew how he died.
Yes.
Or they knew that he died.
Yes.
They wanted to learn more about how he died. And
Yeah.
in the last chapters, Krakauer does a really good job of kind of bringing that whole story home. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to be complimented, I think, for doing a good job of setting that up for your students so that they're aware of that structure, because often students aren't terribly aware of how an author structures a narrative to draw you in and to make it increasingly compelling as you read on.
And I think one of the sources that I used, an outside source that I used, was a podcast early in the scaffolding part of it.
Right.
But what students really loved is that it was a podcast, produced by actors that kind of put themselves in the wild. It was called Freezing to Death or something like that.
Oh,
so
yeah.
it's this narrative that's done by these professionals, and it just sounds like it's really happening to somebody. But they loved that, and the reason.
I think you told me about that. It's like the biology of
What happens to your body
exactly, right,
under those circumstances.
Yeah,
The students really like that.
Yeah.
And then it kind of put them in a place where, because all they saw was with Chris McCandless was in the wild. Well, what does the wild mean to these students?
Right.
They've never been in the wild.
Yeah,
So
certainly not in the snow.
that resonated, and so that really resonated, and I
Yeah.
think they got the pathos from that, right? They felt the emotion, and then so it's good.
Yeah,
good.
yeah. Although territory rather like the Chris McCandless territory is territory that's accessible to students. It's just about 3 hours drive north.
Yeah.
But it's true that most students.
But you'd be surprised when I gauge them. None of them had. I think 2 have been to Tahoe.
Yeah, and seen snow. Yeah, or know
Right.
what real cold means. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
No, I can
so
understand
that was a
that,
nice
yeah.
buildup, and I think
Right.
that definitely helped the process. But I think that really it's Krakauer's ability to tell the story.
Yeah.
That made it most compelling.
Yeah, good. So maybe now with that background, if you can describe a little bit more what you wanted students to do at this point in the PACT week, and what you felt was successful and less successful.
Yeah. So all the skills that they've learned over this process should show up here.
Yeah.
Right. So their ability
Do you want to show that so that?
So it's a poster I created. So it's 11 by 17,
Uh-huh.
which is the first time they've gotten a poster this big. We've done some smaller 11 by 14s, but
Right.
I got some oohs and ahs when they saw this,
Right.
because they thought it was maybe just, oh, we get to draw, but that wasn't the case. It's actually heavy on writing, although they could decorate however they want. That doesn't bother me. And there isn't enough room to write their answers on.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
they knew that too. They were gonna have to attach paper, either poster paper or binder paper. This was really these were areas to brainstorm about these prompts that I gave them.
Right.
But their collective skills, they should be able to use their collective skills, should have been to be able to answer all these questions.
Right.
So there are different, 2 of the 5, they have to resort to the book to get the evidence.
Right.
2 others of the 5 have to get outside sources
Right.
to answer the questions. And then one final one is really a self-reflection as to how their perception has changed towards McCandless
Oh,
over the course
good.
of
Oh,
the
good,
week.
good. I'm
Yeah.
glad you followed up on that. Yeah, because that
Yeah.
was something, again, we had talked about, is how interesting it is to
Yeah.
study your own perception, your own change in perception.
Yeah.
As Chelsea was discovering with her students in their work on the outsiders. What is the change in perspective from beginning to end? And then finally, we will have to wrap up the interview fairly soon, Rigo, but you talked a little bit, but I'd like you to talk a little bit more about what you might do differently in this, particularly for this part of the project.
Well, for this part, as I mentioned, I should have given them more time to read the questions on their own, the prompts.
Right.
Internalize them, maybe write some notes about them to brainstorm individually.
Right.
Because while this is a
Group project?
it's not a group project.
Okay.
While they're leaning on each other for support
Yeah.
and to pair share and to group share,
Right.
this is an individual assignment. They're
Right.
not doing this as a collective enterprise. They are
Right.
doing this individually. They just happen to be sitting in groups for that support.
Yeah, and we had that same sort of discussion with the one student who clearly was leaning on another student for she was writing an essay for today's in-class timed essay. But it is true that if you use what many teachers are now calling that gradual release model, which I'm sure you've been introduced to in one or another of your classes, where you demonstrate to your students what it is that you'd like them to do. You have sort of yourself doing it, but with a class giving you some contribution. So you have a poster like this, but you ask for the class's contribution. So it's that's the we do, I do, and then we do.
Yes.
And then the third step is students do work in pairs or whatever, or groups of 3 is what you found particularly useful. And then the final step is the do it independently. Do it yourself.
And there are several things that I model in the process. This
Right.
is not something I modeled, but I should have given them more time alone, as I
Yeah.
said, to
Yeah.
read the questions, think about them before I put them in the groups, because I essentially gave them everything too quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
And then
yeah,
I said, like I said, they were reticent. They kind of were just, okay,
yeah.
we know the prompts, but where do we go?
Right, and that's one place where the limits, the 1 week limit of the PACT is difficult because in your case you have the students meeting just 2 days of the week.
2 days a week and then a smaller session on
Right.
Friday.